There is a language in Europe that belongs to no family. Not Latin, not Germanic, not Celtic, not Indo-European at all. It sits alone, surrounded on every side by tongues it does not resemble, spoken by a people who have lived in the same corner of the Pyrenees for longer than almost anyone can say. For centuries, that isolation was treated as a curiosity, a linguistic island, a footnote in the story of Europe. Then geneticists looked closer, and the footnote became a question mark over the entire continent. Because if you carry a surname like Etzeberria, Aguirre, Zabala, Mendizabal, Laraniga, Goicoechea, Urrutia, Zubizarreta, Iturriaga, Ilorza, Garmendia, Itzari, or Aranzadi, names rooted in the Old Basque language, names that describe a house, a hill, a river, a boundary stone, you are carrying more than a family label. Researchers now suggest you may be carrying a genetic echo of something that predates most of what we call Europe. This is the story of what the DNA of the Basque people actually shows, and why, for decades, historians thought they understood it, until the genome complicated everything. For most of modern history, the accepted story of the Basques was fairly tidy. Historians and linguists treated them as a remnant population, the descendants of pre-Roman inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula who, through geographic isolation in the Pyrenees, resisted the waves of conquest and language replacement that swept over the rest of Western Europe. Romans came and left Latin everywhere else. Visigoths came and went. Moors crossed from North Africa and reshaped the Iberian South. Through all of it, the story went, the Basques simply stayed put, protected by mountains, and kept speaking something older than any of the invaders' tongues. It was a clean narrative. Isolation explained the language. Isolation explained the customs. Isolation explained why Basque surnames still describe a literal farmhouse. An etsi, the way land ownership was tracked 1,000 years ago. The mountains had done the work of a time capsule. It made sense. It was also, researchers would eventually argue, too simple. The first cracks did not come from genetics at all. They came from linguists and archaeologists who noticed something odd. Basque is not simply old. It appears to be a survivor of a linguistic layer that existed in Western Europe before the arrival of Indo-European languages altogether. The languages that would eventually become Latin, Celtic, Germanic, and nearly everything else spoken from Portugal to India. If that was true, Basque wasn't just a regional holdout. It was a fossil of a Europe that existed before most of Europe as we recognize it linguistically had even formed. That raised an uncomfortable question. If the language was that old, what about the people speaking it? Were the Basques simply an unusually well-preserved population, or were they something genuinely distinct? A population that had never fully absorbed the massive migrations that reshaped the ancestry of nearly everyone else on the continent? This is where genetics entered the story, and where the tidy explanation began to strain. Modern population genetics works by comparing patterns across the genome, not a single gene, but millions of small variations shared in different combinations across ancient and living people. Researchers use several tools for this. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, traces maternal lineages across generations. Y chromosome DNA, passed father to son, traces paternal lines. And autosomal DNA, the broad, mixed inheritance from both parents, allows scientists to estimate how much ancestry a population carries from different ancient source groups, and roughly when that mixing happened. When researchers began applying these tools to Basque populations, they expected to find, at most, a population that was simply less mixed than its neighbors. What they found instead was a population that seemed to be preserving something almost nowhere else in Western Europe had preserved in the same proportions. Here is where the story stopped being simple. Ancient DNA studies of prehistoric Iberia, most notably a landmark 2019 study led by geneticist Inigo Olalde and colleagues, published in Science, examining hundreds of ancient genomes from the Iberian Peninsula, found that around 5,000 years ago, a wave of migration from the Eurasian steppes swept into Iberia, as it had across nearly all of Europe. That migration brought new ancestry, new burial customs, new male lineages, and eventually contributed heavily to the genetic makeup of nearly every population in Western Europe. including most of modern Spain and France. Except, the data suggested, in one place, the ancestors of the Basques appear to carry noticeably less of that steppe-derived ancestry than their genetic neighbors, a genetic anomaly amid a continent-wide replacement event. In other words, while the rest of Iberia was being genetically transformed by newcomers, the population that would become the Basques seems to have been mixing with those newcomers far less than everyone around them. That is not what a simple, isolated mountain population story would necessarily predict on its own. Isolation can preserve a language. But this looked like something more specific. A population that, for reasons still not fully understood, did not fully merge with the wave that reshaped almost everyone else. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. If you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating when the evidence starts rewriting the map instead of just filling it in, this is exactly the kind of story worth sticking around for, because it only gets stranger from here. Researchers have proposed several frameworks to explain what the data seems to show, and it's important to say plainly, no single explanation has been proven beyond dispute. This remains an active area of research. One possibility is a founder effect combined with sustained partial isolation, a scenario where a regional Iron Age population, already somewhat distinct, experienced limited further admixture due to the geography of the Western Pyrenees, allowing older ancestry patterns to persist at higher frequencies than in surrounding, more mixed regions. A second possibility involves selective cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, the idea that incoming groups may have introduced new technologies, language shifts, or cultural practices elsewhere in Iberia, while the ancestors of the Basques adopted some external influences without a corresponding large-scale replacement of the existing population's ancestry. A third framework, more provisional, suggests the region may have functioned as a genetic refuge zone during a period of broader continental upheaval, not entirely untouched, but relatively buffered, allowing a distinctive ancestry profile to persist into the Iron Age and beyond, closer to earlier Neolithic and even Mesolithic hunter-gatherer baselines than most of their neighbors. None of these frameworks claims the Basques are unmixed or genetically frozen in time. All human populations mix, migrate, and absorb outside ancestry to some degree, and the Basque genome shows evidence of this too. What the frameworks share is a more modest, but more interesting claim that the Basques appear to preserve an unusually high proportion of a genetic layer that mostly disappeared elsewhere in Western Europe. The Olalde study was, in this sense, the landmark moment. It didn't rely on a handful of samples or an isolated guess. It drew on a broad panel of ancient genomes spanning thousands of years of Iberian prehistory, allowing researchers to actually watch ancestry proportions shift over time, population by population, region by region. That kind of resolution is what allowed scientists to say, with real confidence, that something distinct happened, or rather, did not happen, in the Basque country while it was happening almost everywhere else. And that is where the twist arrives. The surprise was not that the Basques turned out to be purer or more ancient than everyone assumed, the way older, cruder narratives about the population sometimes framed it. The surprise was more precise and more scientifically interesting. The Basques appear to be a genuine genetic continuation of Iron Age Iberian populations, largely bypassed by a demographic transformation that affected nearly the entire rest of the continent. Not untouched, not pure, but less overwritten. The old story said, the Basques stayed the same because the mountains kept them separate. The genome suggests something subtler and stranger. The mountains did not just protect a language. They preserved a demographic signal from a version of Europe that existed before the population movements that gave rise to the ancestry most Europeans carry today. That single fact reframes everything else. The distinctive Basque blood type frequencies researchers had puzzled over for decades, most notably the region's unusually high rate of Rh-negative blood, are now understood not as some mysterious anomaly, but as a plausible downstream consequence of this same reduced admixture. A population where certain ancient allele frequencies simply had less opportunity to be diluted by later arrivals. This is bigger than one population in northern Spain and southern France. It is a reminder that the map most of us were taught, clean labels like Celtic, Iberian, Germanic, each occupying a tidy colored region, was always a simplification. Real human history does not move in straight lines. Populations do not arrive, settle, and stay fixed. They move, retreat, mix unevenly, absorb each other partially, and sometimes, in one particular valley or mountain range, they simply don't mix as much as everyone assumed. The genome remembers what the historical record often smooths over. Picture, for a moment, the Western Pyrenees as they would have looked 3,000 years ago. Steep green ridgelines rolling down toward the Bay of Biscay. Oak and beech forests thick along the river valleys. Small farmsteads scattered along terraced hillsides, each one an Etsy, a house, that would, centuries later, lend its name to a family, and that family's name to a surname carried forward through generations who never left. Smoke rising from stone hearths in the fog of an Atlantic autumn. Shepherds moving flocks along high mountain passes that connected valleys without ever quite connecting them to the wider world beyond. This was not emptiness. It was a self-contained world, dense with its own internal exchange, its own internal continuity. A world that, evidence suggests, simply absorbed less of what was happening on the plains beyond the peaks. It is a landscape built for continuity. And the genome, it turns out, took notes. If your family carries one of those old Basque surnames, a name built from Etsy, from Mendy, from Ituri, from Zabel, you are not just carrying a word. You may be carrying a fragment of demographic history that, according to current evidence, reaches back further, relatively unbroken, than almost anywhere else on the continent. Not untouched by time. Not immune to change. But a lineage that appears to have absorbed the great transformations of European prehistory more slowly, and less completely, than nearly everyone around it. Scientists remain cautious about pushing this story further than the data allows. This is not proof of an unbroken bloodline in any mystical sense, and it does not mean modern Basques are somehow more original or more valuable than any other population. Genetic variation does not map onto simplistic categories of purity, and no serious researcher frames it that way. What the evidence does suggest, carefully and provisionally, is that the Basque country preserves a genuinely unusual demographic signal, one that survived a continental-scale transformation nearly everyone else experienced in full. If you find stories like this fascinating, where the evidence doesn't just confirm the old map, but quietly redraws it, it might be worth sticking around, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most of us were ever taught. The old story said the Basques were isolated, and that isolation preserved a language. The deeper story, the one the genome is still being asked to tell in full, is that isolation preserved something older than the language itself, a population that watched the rest of a continent transform around it, and did not transform in the same way. The mountains did not just keep out invaders. They kept, in the smallest fragments of shared DNA passed down through thousands of years of Pyrenean winters, a version of Europe that existed before Europe, in the demographic sense we usually mean, had even finished being made. That is not a settled ending. It is an open one. Every new ancient genome pulled from a cave floor or a Bronze Age burial adds another layer to a story that researchers say is still being written, which means that the next surprising signal from the same soil may still be waiting to be found. If stories like this interest you, where a name, a bloodline, or a buried genome quietly rewrites what we thought we understood, subscribe, because history, it turns out, has never stopped being investigated.